Committee Room 30, signed. 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 Committee Room 30, sound. Committee Room 30, sound.
The public. Thank you. So item number 6 then is the draft minutes. Can I refer members to draft minutes of proceedings at pages 258 to 266 of the meeting pack? Are members content that the draft minutes of meeting 14th November are a true reflection of the proceedings? Content? Okay. Item number 7, matters arising. I have none. Okay. So item number 8 then, which is EU Regulation 2024-2747, Internal Market Emergency and Resilient Act, and Departmental Oral Evidence. So just to inform everybody, this item will be recorded by Hansard. So items 8, 9 and 10 are oral evidence sessions with departmental officials on the 3 acts together collectively, known as the Internal Market Emergency and Resilience Act Omnibus, or AMERA, which we have just received legal advice on. So item 8 relates to Regulation EU 2024-2747, item 9 relates to EU Regulation 2024-2748, and item 10 relates to Directive EU 2024-2749. The relevant papers for these 3 items are at pages 6257 of our meeting pack and 3 to 31 of our tabled papers, which were received yesterday. This policy area is substantively reserved, and the British Government provided EMs on all 3 published acts when notifying the committee. The EM can be found at pages 58 to 65 of our meeting pack. So the Executive Office have provided an assessment of impact, and that can be found at pages 4 to 5 of the table papers. This information and the oral evidence we're about to hear relates to the 3 EU acts under consideration today. Department for Economy has provided an assessment of the impact on Regulation 2024-2748 and the Directive 2749, and these can be found at pages 9 to 18 of our table packs. DFE says that it is not possible for the Department to provide detailed analysis on matters which are not within its official responsibilities and or devolved competence. It refers to the British Government's assessment in its EM and indicated that officials wouldn't attend the meeting today. So, we did have that issue earlier on in the year, and that might be something we might want to discuss after we take evidence before us today. So we can come back to that issue of no DFE officials, but we have officials from the Executive Office here. So can I remind members that the committee will need to take a decision on whether to hold an inquiry on each individual act, and will do so following the evidence session. So can I welcome Karen Pearson, Director of COVID Strategy, Programme for Government Civil Contingencies within the Executive Office, and I'm going to hand over to yourself, Karen, to brief us.
Thank you, Chair. I suppose for the Executive Office, our issues are very narrow indeed. It's the civil contingencies element of my job that I'm here to see if I can provide you with some assistance on, because it's very clear from the instruments that COVID is the driving force for bringing these instruments forward. And if there's anything I can help you with on the broader civil contingencies environment, particularly on the devolved side in Northern Ireland or here, then that's what I'm here to do. But what I would say is, we all lived through COVID, and we all lived through difficulties for things like supply chains and people moving and all of those things. So it's really to give you any assistance you want on that broader landscape.
Okay. So in terms of the detail of the actual amendment to the Act, is it your position that there's little or no information you can give on that?
I'm afraid that's correct, yes. Okay. Yeah.
Okay. And then just in terms of the broader scale, obviously we have the memory of COVID. I mean, there may be things similar to that or other emergencies coming forward. So on the basis of the experience that we've had with COVID, supply chains, etc., is the premise of this legislation, would you envisage being positive?
What I can share is that during and after COVID, we have developed our civil contingencies arrangements here considerably. Declan, you lived through it. It's very different to the way it was done in the past. So we have a very clear focus on civil contingencies, on risk assessment, on aligning risk with government priorities and with departmental priorities, and collaboration. So supply chains is a good example. There are many others. So we've got about 44 risks that we are actively managing at a strategic level, and the learning of COVID, continuous improvement is where we are at strategic level. So we have a new civil contingencies framework called Building Resilience Together, which is in the public domain. We have a not published, but we have an actively managed risk register. And then we have a learning and development strategy where we're working with our civil contingencies colleagues to do more in this space. Supply chains is a good one. DFE have a group on it, and it's very active and is collaborative across departments. There are other groups on things like energy supply, telecoms, future pandemic planning. So anything that helps us continuously improve is of interest to us. But the measures themselves are not going to bite on my department's remit in a regulatory way. But that continuous improvement approach is exactly where we are. So the COVID experience is a welcome one. We've got to take the learning. We've got to keep improving. So that's where we are.
Okay, so and our committee is very specifically focused on that thing. So, and I understand. I mean, some of this might not be even within the executive office, but in terms of the EM provided to us by the British government, they're telling us that the Emira omnibus package will obviously be dependent on the substance of the implementing acts, and we're not going to know that until such times as the implementing acts come along, and that could be God knows when. But they're saying they expect that any measures introduced would be targeted and aimed to ease the flow of goods, and therefore the British government doesn't expect that these measures would introduce any significant additional regulatory burdens for business or traders here. So you have nothing to say that or suggest anything different to that?
It wouldn't be within the remit of my department to have a specific view on that. My issue is, are we making situations safer for citizens in a future significant crisis?
Okay, thank you. David?
So just in terms of saying that it won't impact upon your department in a regulatory way, and so on, are we making things safer? It's fair to say that a lot of this, we don't really know until such a time as it's going to be in operation. So it could have an impact at some time. It could make things either safer or less safe for citizens here, in our view. At a particular time, we just don't know, because it literally is about handing powers to EU institutions to make decisions in a quicker way, in a less checked way, at a time of emergency. So whilst I understand the logic for having those, and I imagine having similar rules within the UK and so on, we can't possibly know the exact impact until such a time as we're using them, as was the case with COVID, I guess.
I think that's a fair comment, and it's something that can be looked at as matters progress, but as we stand today, based on the information we have, it's not a measure that's going to massively impact on TEO.
Because we're not in an emergency?
We're not in an emergency, yes. But I think our approach to civil contingencies is structured around prepare, respond and recover. So that prepare stage is where we do the pre-thinking. So we don't have to wait.
Some of that would be a bit forecasting what the EU may or may not do around these things. We can't. I guess that's the only point I'm trying to establish here, is we can't possibly know what the EU would do with these powers until such a time as we're in a situation where they have to be used. I've no doubt, actually, to be fair, that they're probably being done with the best intentions. I'm not trying to make them sound sinister. What I'm saying is that it's sort of an unchecked ability to legislate around standards and so on without, legislate's probably the wrong word, but have changes around standards and so on, relatively unchecked at a time of emergency, but we can't possibly know what they might change or what they may loosen or to try and oil the wheels during that time.
My reading, and again, it's not for my department, but my reading is it's about setting out a framework, a structure, some sort of clarity for what might happen in the future in an emergency. But the precise detail, you're right, would have to wait. But in that prepare stage, which is what we can all do, is really important. But I think that's where they are now. They're setting out to give some clarity to business on what might happen.
Steve?
Yeah, just a quick one. Thanks very much indeed, and thanks very much, Karen. Declaration of interest. I've worked on UK civil contingency and military contingency operations before, so I understand the thing. The definition and the requirement is basically around what the definition the EU puts on the word emergency, because civil contingencies will only be triggered for a very specific set of areas that are outlined by UK government in specific circumstances. But this piece of legislation, this moves the definition of an emergency to the EU, which we don't have any particular say in. So therefore, does your department have any views on how, if the EU declared an emergency, because one of the things we don't have from any of the information is how they define that emergency. It could be anything. Does that mean, therefore, what has priority for you? Is it the UK civil contingency rules and regulations, and that being triggered by the various processes that I'm not going to go into in this open forum? Or is it if the EU declares an emergency and you would be bound by that?
In the devolved space, what has priority for me is what's happening here. So we have in our Building Resilience Together framework, in COVID, we had to go from a very large stand-up, which you'll understand, the scale of that, to we now have a more tiered response in our framework, which is defined. So we have about 5 different levels. It also depends on the nature of the emergency. So if, for instance, it's an operational issue, has it been declared a major incident, or am I being asked to stand up the civil contingencies arrangement? So our own framework defines that in the devolved space. Yep. And then you get to UK for higher level national issues. Beyond that, I wouldn't be able to comment, but my priority is what happens here, and have we got the right framework for it to define our own stand-up response.
Okay. So just for clarity, therefore, if there is an emergency being declared, it'll either be declared by the UK civil contingency, or in certain circumstances, let's say for local flooding or something like that, It can be done from a Northern Ireland perspective. But at the present moment in time, there is no recognition of something external saying there is now an emergency situation, because at the present moment in time, we've only got the devolved powers and the UK powers to do with it.
I think we're saying the same thing.
Yeah.
I think we're saying
I just
the
need
same.
it just for the clarity bit of it.
So, for instance, in a flood, what I would expect is 2 principles to apply. Number 1, lead government department would be leading until they're exhausted or need some additional support from, you understand? Okay. And secondly, subsidiarity. So there's operational merit in an emergency being managed at the lowest possible level because the people on the ground know what they're doing. So in our new framework, that 5-tiered response gives us the ability to say, how far have we gone through that emergency journey? Is it a major emergency? Is it national? What do I need to do to stand up to support? I can do that. A different government department can do that. First and Deputy First Minister can do that. First responders can do that. They can all ask for that. So it's a community of voices around what are we actually dealing with here that triggers the response. I think that's...
That's fine.
Is that okay? Thank you.
Grand job. Karen, no other questions. Nobody else has indicated, so thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks very much. So, members, we obviously had asked the Department for the Economy to be here. They didn't send anybody, And we had this issue earlier on in the year with DERA, and we stood firm, and DERA officials did come. So it's obviously very disappointing that DFE didn't send officials today. Much that I understand, they probably would have been able to add very little to the conversation. Paul, is there something you want to add to that?
Chair, thank you. I mean, it might just be helpful to go back to the first principles on this. Important to remember that just because responsibility for a decision is a reserved or even an accepted matter for the UK government, that doesn't mean that their decision will necessarily have not have an impact in relation to devolved matters. So you saw a really obvious example of that this week in relation to the UK government's decision in respect of inheritance tax for farms. That's not a devolved matter. However, clearly it will have an impact as far as devolved matters are concerned, and that's why we've seen our ministers quite rightly and properly offering a view on what that impact is and responding to it. Everybody, I think, accepts that it's right and proper for them to talk about what that impact will be. And what's important to them is the impact as far as devolved matters are concerned. And that's the same principle that needs to inform the work that this committee is doing as well, and the approach of departments to engaging with this committee. So you've got a statutory duty to have regard to whether a published impact is likely to have a significant impact. You want, in fact, you need to know what is the views of the experts in relation to that impact, and as far as the impact in respect of devolved matters is concerned, then that expertise lies with the relevant department. And you have had departments come and give evidence to you. You've just had a departmental official here, even though something is a reserved matter, given the perspective of the executive office on that, as you would expect. Now, there will be times when a department will say that a proposal will not affect anything that falls within their responsibility, and therefore they can't offer a view on it. And that's absolutely fine. That's effectively they're saying then that it will not have any impact on matters for which they are responsible. What isn't acceptable, and I'm talking in the general position here rather than the individual response that you've got in front of you, what wouldn't be acceptable from your perspective is if a department was saying, well, it might have an impact on matters for which we're responsible, but because ultimately it's a reserved matter, we haven't bothered assessing what impact it is going to be, or worse still, we have assessed it, but we're not going to share with you what our assessment is. So I just thought it was important to remind you of that, because that was the context in which you previously wrote the First and Deputy First Minister to explain why it was important that departments needed to engage here. And I suppose just in finishing, I should say I'm giving you that as the general overview. I'm not saying that in respect of what the Department for the Economy have given you today that they should have come or they could have, but that's for you to assess on the basis of the information you've got in front of you. But just as a reminder, where things stand in terms of your expectations for departments engaging with you on matters which may be reserved or accepted. Chair?
Yes, Jonathan?
Yeah, no, look, thanks for that. And I was just about to come in before Paul did. Look, we were hard on the Department for Agriculture officials when they did the same thing. So I think it's only fair that we're equal right across the board, and we do need to go back to the Department for Economy on this issue to ensure that officials are before the committee and that it isn't just a case of hand wringing, it's reserved or whatever, it's nothing to do with us. It's just important whether they come to committee and can't give us much information because they don't have it. The very fact that they're willing to come along to try to answer members' questions certainly is important, and I would propose that the committee writes to the officials in the Department for Economy setting out our view clearly on that in the same way we did for the Department of Agriculture officials.
I mean, I would accept that, Jonathan. I mean, I actually would go a step further. I would suggest that myself and David as Vice Chair, along with the Clerk and maybe Paul, would try and meet with the Permanent Secretary or the Minister just to further emphasise the importance of it.
Absolutely. No, happy for that proposed state of action as well.
Okay, everybody content, Declan?
Yeah, well, I would go a step further again. Paul has usefully reminded us of what action we took at the time, that there was a letter issued to FM and DFM. I had it in my mind that perhaps we had communicated with all of the individual departments, but in light of that reminder, Paul, yes, of course, meet with the Permanent Secretary, but I think that there should be a communication issued to the Executive Office, reiterating what was previously communicated, and that there is an expectation within this committee, regardless of what officials can bring to the discussion or not, that if the issue is relevant to their committee, their department, and the committee is addressing and scrutinising a particular piece of legislation, our expectation is that officials will attend, and then allow TEO then to triage that message across the full range of departments, and particularly those which are going to be most material to the business of this committee.
Steve?
Yeah, just going on, fully support what Declan and yourself, Chair, said as well. Just interesting that I wonder if it's the departments are looking at what was in the EM in the previous documentation to come to that conclusion that they weren't going to add very much, and how they can come to that opinion without actually expressing it properly to the committee. I'm just not quite sure of the mechanism. One of the things I would thoroughly encourage you to have that conversation with the Permanent Secretary, but actually work out how they could come to that conclusion if it was based on an EM that we have seen, and we have probably come to a counter view of it. So there's something fundamentally skewed about how the evaluation of interest is there. And I think maybe, and I think as sort of Paul and Declan has pointed out, I think it's important that people realise that this is the committee's job to make is to be the arbiter of that, so they can produce the evidence before us, but they filtering out, deciding they're not going to give, I don't think it's appropriate.
Okay, point all well made. We'll pick up on all of that.
Yep.
Okay, so just moving on to the items that we have.
Just a sort of further one, Chair, as well. I know we're probably going to get to the conversation at this moment about sort of what we're going to do about these particular sort of regulations. The one piece that is really missing in my mind at the moment is the definition of how the EU defines an emergency. And I just wonder if it would be appropriate if we could ask RAISE to do some research on that, because I think I've just been watching some of the EU confirmation. That's kind of sad puppy. I look at some of the stuff. But some of the EU confirmation for the commissioners, and the question of what was defined as an emergency came up quite a few times, and it's a very, very broad concept, from everything from floods in Valencia to Donald Trump. Maybe just if we understood what was this regulation was going to refer to, because quite frankly I haven't got the knowledge at the moment to know what the EU defines as an emergency.
Okay. Does the committee want to take a view on that? I mean, because we're going to move on now to actually take the committee's view on this piece of it.
Chair, no, look, I would agree with Steve. That's been the point that's been in my head in relation to what defines an emergency. Like we've heard it even within the UK, even within Northern Ireland. The word emergency is branded about quite often to any given related circumstances. I don't think look, if Steve wants to get that clarity or that paper, I have no issue with that, but I suppose probably it doesn't prevent me at this stage from making a decision what I think needs to happen right now. So that's with that in mind.
Okay, well, I mean, I'm actually going, I don't think actually we need a committee. I mean, an individual member can go to RAISE and ask those questions. So, I mean, I think it's the job of this committee to make a decision whether we have an inquiry or not, and what we do when we have that decision made. So, I mean, I think we should move to that, notwithstanding the right of any individual member to contact RAISE for further evidence or information that they may wish. So
it's probably something we can look to do if there is any further items come forward that are relevant to emergency planning from the EU. It's something to bear in mind.
So anyway, just moving on, I just want to advise everybody. I mean, we've heard evidence, we've sought legal advice. The explanatory memorandum indicates that the impact of the amendments applicable under the Windsor framework will depend on the substance of implementing acts, and we have no idea what they will be. British government expects that any measures introduced under this package would be targeted with the aim of easing the flow of goods. It does not expect any significant additional regulatory burdens for businesses or traders here in the north. Further, the British government does not expect any of these measures to cause any significant additional regulatory costs, because they relate to market surveillance and conformity assessment activities, which in any case are already undertaken for the products in question. So, under paragraph 8.1 of Schedule 6B of the 1998 Act, This committee must decide today whether or not to hold an inquiry into the published replacement EU Act that has been notified. Should the committee fail to do so or fail to decide, the failure will be treated as a decision not to hold an inquiry. So I'm just going to put the question having regard to the legal advice on whether it appears likely replacement EU Act significantly differs in whole or part, content or scope with the EU instruments which it amends, and also the assessments, departmental assessments, on whether it appears likely that the Replacement Act would have a significant impact specific to everyday life, communities here in a way is liable to persist. Do members wish to hold an inquiry into Regulation EU 2024-2747, Internal Markets Emergency and Resilience Act? David?
Chair, I'm going to outline, it's going to be the same rationale for each of these, so I'll outline it now to save us going through it again. But given some of the advice we've had today, that it is in legal terms a significant change, but it seems from the briefing we've had as well, and from reading, these are quite wide-ranging powers, and powers that we cannot foresee how they would be used until a time of emergency. We also, as unionists, have in principle an objection to what is potential for undemocratic divergence and unchecked power of the EU over Northern Ireland around these regulations. And on that basis, we're going to propose that we have an inquiry.
Okay, any alternative views? Yep.
Yeah, Chair, I suppose taking on board all the points that have been made, for me the bit that just is standing out is that it's impossible to foresee. And I'm not actually sure what an inquiry would actually achieve. And what reassures me, what kind of makes that easier, is that the UK government are quite clear that they're putting their own planning measures in place. So I'm content not to hold an inquiry because I don't understand what an inquiry would achieve, because we don't know what we're actually dealing with.
Okay. Owen?
Yeah, thank you, Chair, and fully agree with what Kate has said around what will be critical here will be the implementing legislation, and we will not have that over the course of an inquiry to scrutinise, so an inquiry won't necessarily shed any further light. But also our test around impact is a significant negative impact that's liable to persist. Given that these are emergency measures, it's unlikely to see how they would be liable to persist in Northern Ireland were they to be implemented. But also, I think page 21 of the Lord's report points to the fact that these are our product safety and conformity assessment standards which already apply in Northern Ireland. And this is about giving increased flexibility to provide derogations effectively in respect of those where there is a need to get products onto the market quicker in an emergency. And I think it's clear that when we're talking about an emergency, we're talking about crises of the scale of the Russian invasion of Ukraine or the COVID-19 pandemic. And there is an established scrutiny body in terms of the European Parliament and the Member States, who I'm sure will be following what's happening in terms of the Commission very, very closely. So I think it would actually be negative, Chair, were we to be in a situation where these product safety requirements and conformity assessments applied in Northern Ireland and we had no flexibility in response to an emergency. And I think that would be the bigger risk were this not to apply in Northern Ireland in those circumstances.
Thank you. So I mean, I'm going to make the assumption, members, that the position is going to be the same with regard to all three of these pieces of legislation. So if members are happy and content and agree, one vote for all three. So I'll just are we allowed to do that?
I think it's maybe best if we take the three
Okay,
votes.
fair enough.
But if a decision is made to hold an inquiry, then the follow-up actions could be agreed.
So we'll have to do. Would you have to do three separate votes?
If
then?
that's okay.
Okay, 100%. Right. So we'll just go on the first one then, which is EU Regulation 2024-2747. Those in favour of an inquiry, please raise their hand. Those against?
Okay, so the proposal was to hold an inquiry into EU Regulation 2024-2747. Voting aye, David Brooks, Jonathan Buckley, Joanne Bunting and Steve Aiken. Voting no, Philip McGuigan, Declan Kearney, Emma Sheeran and Owen Tennyson and Kate Nicholl. So the proposal falls.
Okay, and based again on the similar question of impact legally and across society in the North, can I ask members, do they wish to hold an inquiry into regulation EU 2024-2748 as regards emergency procedures for the conformity assessment, presumption of conformity, adoption of common specifications and market surveillance due to an internal market emergency? Yes. Those in favour, raise their hands. Okay, those opposed? Okay.
Okay, so again, I'll just summarise briefly the proposal to hold an inquiry on Regulation 2024-2748. 4 members voted aye, 5 members voted no, so the proposal falls.
Okay, so moving then to Directive EU 2024-2749. Do members wish to hold an inquiry into this directive as regards emergency procedures for the conformity assessment, presumption of conformity, adoption of common specifications and market surveillance due to an internal market? Those in favour of an inquiry, raise their hands. Those opposed? Okay.
Okay, so the proposal to hold an inquiry into Directive 2024-2749, 4 members voted aye, 5 members voted no, so the proposal falls.
Okay. Just moving on then, members, to item number 11 on the agenda, which is proposal for regulation on the welfare of dogs and cats and their traceability and consideration of survey responses. So if I can refer everybody to the relevant papers at pages 271 to 317 of our meeting pack. The EU has indicated that it considers the proposal to be within the scope of the Windsor framework and therefore may seek to add it to the framework via Article 13.4. At its meeting on 3rd of October, the committee heard oral evidence from the Department of Agriculture, Environment and Rural Affairs and agreed to monitor the proposal and seek views from stakeholders. So the committee has received a response on 7th of November from the British Government stating that it continues to assess and monitor the progress of this proposal and that it continues to engage with the European Commission. Can also refer members to Citizen Space Survey responses and email submissions, and they're at pages 275 to 317 of the pack. Just to advise you that 7 responses have been received via Citizen Space and additional responses were received via email. Summary: 5 animal welfare organisations are of the view that it doesn't appear likely that the proposed act would have a significant negative impact, and the respondents welcomed the proposed legislation. These respondents also state that it appears that likely that not applying the EU Act would have a significant negative impact. Respondents made recommendations on further improvements to animal welfare which could be made through domestic legislation. They also raised concerns about enforcement, resources and training in relation to the proposed Act. Some respondents highlighted areas where they believe the proposed Act could be strengthened. Belfast City Council stated that the proposed EU legislation is likely to have a significant impact here and highlighted the costs to implement the proposal and the Council's funding concerns. So can I remind everybody, as previously agreed, both Reyes and Dira have been asked to update the committee of any changes to the text they're proposed by the Council of the EU or the European Parliament which would have a significant impact specific to everyday life of communities in a way that is liable to persist. Just to let you know that the issues raised are wider than the committee's remit, so we may wish to forward the submissions to the relevant statutory committee. Is everybody? Yep, go ahead, Jonathan.
Thanks, Chair. No, particularly concerned regarding Belfast City Council's response, given particularly the number of stakeholders that it would represent in terms of our constituents and ratepayers. I suppose what concerns me with it is the fact that just Belfast City Council is the only local authority that has responded. So that, for a start, would give me concern, because obviously I would imagine every single council authority would I would assume have similar issues. I know we're not at the stage where an inquiry is on the deadline for this one in terms of we're still monitoring that space, but would it be appropriate for the committee to flag that particular Belfast City Council response with other councils? Is that appropriate? I'm not sure. But I don't understand why other councils are not engaging in this process, given the fact that Belfast City Council says it's likely to have a significant everyday impact.
We might be accused of trying to lead
Okay.
the type of response that we're taking. I mean, we all have members on councils across the north. I don't see any issue as political parties alerting our own councillors to see if their own council have any issue with this particular potential piece of legislation.
Yeah.
I think that's probably the best way to go about it, Jonathan.
Could I ask just to follow up on that, and I take your point. Has there been on any other citizen space response? Has there been engagement from any other local authority on any other issue to date? Just out of interest.
Yes, there has. Yeah.
There has.
But Belfast City Council did say that if they had more time to respond, they might provide some further information. So if the committee wished, we could respond to them and say that they could submit this via email, and likewise from other stakeholders have chosen to do that as well, albeit they don't address the specific test that the survey asks them to.
Okay, no, that's fair enough.
And you made the point at the beginning of your contribution. I mean, we haven't been notified of this, so obviously, if and when we are notified, then our own procedures will kick in, and we may want to delve deeper and ask further questions of everybody. Mm-hmm. So everybody content? Okay, just remind me where I'm at. So then what we're going to do then is we're going to note the responses and forward them to the Committee for Agriculture, Environment and Rural Affairs, because there are issues there that go beyond the remit of this committee, and we will also put the responses onto the committee webpage as evidence received. Okay, so moving on then to item number 12 on the agenda. Yep, proposal for regulation amending classification on labelling and packaging of substances and mixtures, consideration of survey responses. So can I refer members to Citizen Space Survey response at page 319 at our meeting on 12th September. This proposed act was identified as a priority during the committee's forward work planning exercise. The committee agreed to seek views from stakeholders and heard evidence from departmental officials on the 24th of October. One response has been received from Fuels Industry UK Limited. The organisation is currently assessing the impact of the amendment to the CLP regulation. So they have forwarded the survey to a range of other trade associations involved in the supply of substances and mixtures here. However, no one else has responded to the survey yet. When the committee is notified of the published act, and should the committee decide to hold an inquiry, the survey will again be issued and can target stakeholders which have been identified. So are members content that the response is published on the committee webpage? Okay, so moving on then, item number 13, which is committee travel, and it's a written report on our visit to Brussels. Can I refer members to the report on the committee's visit to Brussels? It's at page 320 to 323. This summarises the committee's engagements during the study visit in order to understand the process and development of EU policy and legislation, and to develop relationships with stakeholders in Brussels. We heard from a number of stakeholders on the importance of further engagement following the publication of the Commission work programme in early 2025 and opportunities for direct engagement with MEPs. So in due course, the Secretariat team will bring options to the committee for consideration in relation to further engagement in Brussels and also Westminster in 2025. Content or any comments, Steve?
Yeah, thank you very much indeed. And I thought it was a well-conducted visit, and thank you very much indeed for the team for all the work they did. I got a response from the Norwegian delegation, and if the chair and deputy chair would so care, I can pass it on to you, so it can go out to the rest of the members.
Yeah. Thank you. Okay, so everybody's content to note the report. Correspondence, pages 325 to 330 of our pack. Correspondence from the chair of the committee on procedures, advising that a draft standing order and substitute members for this committee has been agreed and a motion has been tabled. The debate is provisionally scheduled, well, I think it's more than provisionally now, on Tuesday 26th of November, so it's next Tuesday, in autumn 2025, the Committee on Procedures, in conjunction with this committee, intends to review the provision of substitute members and whether these arrangements, together with availability of remote attendance, are sufficient to enable us to effectively discharge its statutory functions. Just to let you know, the Secretary team are going to bring forward operating procedures for substitute members to the committee for consideration and agreement at our next meeting next Thursday. And just to inform everybody that I'd probably make a few comments on this at the debate on behalf of the committee, if everybody's content. Yep.
Paul, sorry, what we've got Paul here. You define the difference between substitute and proxy.
So a substitute member is one then that's entitled to receive the papers that you would all get and to actually come along to the meeting and carry out a vote, whereas a proxy is where a member would be absent, and in that member's absence another member who was there would vote on their behalf.
So the substitute is actually, through the chair, the substitute is actually replacing the member as opposed to someone just acting in a position where they can vote for it.
Exactly, yeah.
Okay.
Okay, pages 331 to 333 of the pack is a response from the British Cabinet Office on the applicability of the EU deforestation regulation under the Windsor framework. They state that it is considering its approach, and the committee has requested that an update be provided on a quarterly basis. Everybody content to note? 14.3, pages 334 to 337 is a memo from the Assembly's EU Affairs Manager regarding the democratic consent mechanism. Everybody content to note?
Yep.
14.4, pages 338 to 345 is correspondence from GTA, a tobacco and e-cigarette manufacturer, regarding the British Government's tobacco and vape bill and its interaction with the EU Tobacco Products Directive, which applies here. So the EU directive is already in force and is therefore outside the remit of this committee. However, in line with the approach that has been agreed by members in dealing with correspondence of this nature, members may wish to forward the correspondence to the relevant statutory committees and advise this organisation accordingly, noting that our committee's statutory functions relate only to the examination and consideration of new EU acts and replacement EU acts. Content?
Yep.
Are members content to forward alright, so we're going to forward it to the Committee for Health and the Committee for the Executive Office and advise the correspondence accordingly. So, next item is Chair's business, of which I have none, and any other business? None. Okay, date, time, place of next meeting is next Thursday, 28th of November 2024, 10 AM. During meeting. And just to let you all know that we have received no notifications today.
No, 3.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry, I read that wrong. There you go.
This is on the chemicals one
Oh,
that you
yeah,
just
sorry.
mentioned. That was when we have been
Okay.
notified, which we have
Fair
this
enough.
morning, but
So,
it doesn't matter.
There you go.
We can
So
deal with it next week.
with three items to
Committee Room 30, sound. 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 Committee Room 30, signed. 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 Committee Room 30. Sound. 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 Committee Room 30, 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 Sound. Committee Room 30. 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 Sound.